Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cinema Savvy. It's myself, George, rejoined by Cam for, I say, a very special review. This is, of course, another entry in the Steven Spielberg Retrospective, and we have reached the film Always, released in 1989, the first year in which Spielberg had two films out. I've got to add as well. And we're going to be giving our thoughts on this. And if you haven't heard of Always, um, I'm going to say welcome to, I guess, the club pre-January, which is when I discovered this film was a thing. We'll get into all that stuff shortly, but before we do, Cam, lovely to get you back on the podcast. We had you last on for Jaws. Um, Going from Jaws to Always, how'd you feel?
Well, I mean, I'm just excited to do a movie where I can really tap into my all twisted steel and sex appeal.
There's there's going to be a lot of stuff said in this about this film,
Mm,
and watching this film. If I mean, I think I said this. We said The Color Purple was like one of the most un-Spielbergian films, but that's because the subject setting, the way it was shot, everything. This is one of these films that feels nothing like a Spielberg film because the actual question goes to like, how did this happen? We know how it happens. We're going to go over that. But on paper, this isn't one people would associate with him, which makes the behind the scenes actually really fascinating for this film, and what we'll be able to speak about for some of the stuff. But before we get into all of that, we want you to comment along as well. Comment your thoughts on Always. I've already mocked it too much. I'm not gonna just sit here and make terrible jokes about this film the whole time. I'm a bit nicer than that. But please do like, comment, share, and subscribe if you're a fan of Steven Spielberg. Not only is this the place to be, the next four episodes we have are arguably four of his biggest films, and he's made a lot of big films, but the streak that we're about to go on is going to be pretty insane. So if you're watching Always, please do come back for those. I'd be very surprised if you're watching Always and you're not watching those. I really would be surprised if that was the case. And if you don't follow us on social media, it's the best way to find out what videos are coming up, what we're up to. We've now rejoined Instagram, and you can find us on Instagram, the same about Twitter at cinema_savvy, Facebook and letterboxd.com/cinema savvy. And we now have a Redbubble store, which is in the description below. We've switched over there. I'm wearing this Marvel hat, but maybe this month it'll be a Cinema Savvy one, and I'll finally rep some of our own merch. Who knows? Time will tell. But bringing Cam back on, Cam, we've had you on for the Bond stuff, we've had you on for Jaws, and getting on for this. For the people that don't know SpyHards, we've got the podcast link in the description, your socials as well. Tell the people what SpyHards are about.
yeah. So SpyHards is basically a spy movie podcast where every week we look at a different spy movie and determine whether it belongs in what we call the knock list. It's an acronym for need to see official classics. It's very tortured. We know. We've gotten the notes. But we like to look at everything from James Bond and Hitchcock spy movies to really obscure stuff. We'll do like stuff from the 1930s. We'll also do stuff like Condor Man, the Disney film, all over the place, just to always kind of find all the real gems in the genre. And we also do bonus episodes with interviews with directors, writers, actors, people associated with making a lot of these classic spy films.
So everybody, please follow them. It's been always a joy listening to the videos. And there's been a few spy films I've known nothing about, or films that I've seen that I've forgotten were about spy films that completely bemused me. I think Central Intelligence was the first one. I was like, hold on, I forgot that was a film, let alone a spy film. So please do follow them on there. But as we always do with this series, with this show, we're going to kickstart with the IMDb plot synopsis. I copy and paste it in the schedule. I don't read it. You get a paragraph, you get a line. This week's not as bad. So this film, for those unaware that haven't seen Always, that have tuned in tonight, I really appreciate that. It is about the spirit of a recently deceased expert pilot mentors a newer pilot while watching him fall in love with the girlfriend that he left behind. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. And I guess we'll just kick off straight by saying it's a remake of a 1943, I think, film A Guy Named Joe, which we'll get into in a little bit. But Cam, I'm going to jump to you quickly. When we did Jaws, you mentioned Always as I don't think it was the first Spielberg film you saw, but maybe in the memories. Can you tell the people at home of your history with Always potentially, or
Yeah, unlike most human beings, I actually have very vivid memories of the first time I saw Always. And within the kind of the work of Spielberg, I'm pretty sure E.T. was the first one I saw all of. I saw snippets of Jaws and it freaked me out, so it took me a while to build up to seeing Jaws. but I remember at a certain point my parents would rent movies for the two of them to watch when my sister and I, went to bed early or whatever. And I would always want to watch what they had watched the night before. I'd always ask them what it was about, and my mom would basically, as a bedtime story, almost tell me what the movie they were going to watch would be, about. And the next day I would ask about how it was. And I remember the next morning getting up after they'd watched Always and saying, "Can I watch it?" And my mom said, "Yeah, you can watch that." And sat and watched Always. And I mean, I would have been back in those days, things didn't come out on VHS that quickly. So it was probably like a year and a half later. So maybe like 1991, maybe something around there. And so I would have been about 10 years old. And I watched it. I remembered a lot of it when I was rewatching it for this episode, but it wasn't one that's loomed large in my mind. That's for sure.
No, I think that's a really fair thing to say about looming large in the mind because, okay, I joked about it saying I'm not familiar with this. I'd be very curious for people. Is it naive to think that maybe people that were born after the film came out that they might not have heard of it, or certainly when people speak of Spielberg films, what I would say is not rock bottom because it sounds like they're terrible and they're not. The ones that seem to never get spoken about is Sugarland Express,
Yep.
always. We still and ah, does the Twilight Zone count? Because obviously only did a part of it, but when people speak about the ones that aren't really brought, they're sort of three or four. I'd actually argue Amistad to a point, even if that's
Yeah.
actually successful in its own right, but
I would
no
even
one
say
speaks of it.
I would say Empire of the Sun is one also I think a lot
Yes.
of people haven't heard of.
Yeah, and actually, that's a really good plug for last week because we were joined by Tom Woods for that, and we all kind of came together and said that Empire of the Sun to me has been one of the favorite ones I've seen,
Mm,
and no one's spoken about it. And then Tate made the point that when people speak about Empire of the Sun, it's because they will know it as Christian Bale's like breakthrough film,
yeah.
which is remarkable in his own credit how great he is in that film. But it is definitely one of those. It is, and it also it feels like a proper Spielberg film watching it as well. So yeah, it's a very weird one with Always sort of heading into it. And as I said, I hadn't seen this film. I wasn't familiar with this until January when this all came into production, and I was doing the photoshops. I was like, "What's this gospel poster? Like, what is this?" I was like, "Is that John Goodman?" Like, it was a really weird moment just staring at this poster because either side of it, you've got Empire of the Sun, you've got Indiana Jones, and all these like sort of classic posters. Like this just looks like a gospel thing. Obviously, I didn't read the plot. I didn't know about the plot until literally watching it for the first time, and I was like, okay, like I'm really curious about what this film is going to be about. I knew nothing. I knew a couple of cast members, and obviously the plane logo that I've been putting all the photoshops, but I did not realize that it would be not just a sort of romance film, but obviously the whole, that when the spirits live. Is there a subgenre for that? I know that this came out before Ghost, I think, actually, but
Yeah. I mean,
is it-
it's sort of I guess almost you could call it like high concept romantic dramas or something because they are these sort of very earnest, sincere romantic dramas, but they have the high concept of like someone who's dead that comes back. Like they have a very melodramatic aspect too. So very specific kind of vibe that was pretty hot in the late 80s, early 90s there.
yeah, and there is a fantastic British film, not romantic to a point, but Dead Man's Shoes, which deals with something
Mhm.
in a similar light, which I'd recommend to anyone that's not seen that. Very different to Always though, a bit. Yeah, it's something that's not done often, but when it's done well, I think it's a very powerful storytelling device. And I guess what we want to start with this one, we've got the film A Guy Named Joe, 1943 war film. Now, I didn't even know that this was a remake until we first spoke, I think last week. When you're like, I'm going to watch the original. I was like, eh? I was like, I know I've not seen the film yet, but I researched nothing. I hadn't seen it. I essentially, for people at home that are curious with these reviews, if I haven't seen them, I keep away. Not that I mean, I'm not going to go out and look for spoilers. It's silly, but if it got spoiled, that's on me. But if I haven't seen it, I would know next to nothing. I try and keep it that way. And I was really fascinated. We said, okay, it's a remake, and a lot of the time these can be like foreign films that they remake into into the English language. And I was very surprised to find after that it was a wartime film. And Spielberg was not only a very big fan of this, but also Richard Dreyfuss was. And it all went all the way back to Jaws filming that in 1973. They would have filmed that film to come out in 74, and I was very shocked that they had this burning history, which is kind of magnificent in a way because I'm going to come to you in a moment, but the way with reboots is I think the modern conscience of a reboot is it's just it's a soulless cash grab. That's how much of the industry sees reboots now. Whereas I never think it always was that. Obviously, the most famous one will always be Scarface. People like you
Yeah.
can't reboot Scarface. It's like, well, it already was one, wasn't it? And with this, it's clearly coming from the background of somebody that loved the original that hasn't remade it to insult it or to sort of decredit it. He's done like a modern take on it. And just because I haven't read too much, if I'm being honest, I didn't get a chance to rewatch it. Can you tell me a little bit about a guy named Joe, or if the people? I know it's obviously the similar plot to this, but it's
Yeah.
a very interesting way to remake the film. And it explains a lot about this film's plot. I'm going to add as well.
Yeah, so a guy named Joe stars Spencer Tracy and Irene Dunn as sort of the central couple, and it is pretty much the same story, really, of always, but it's set during World War II. So it kind of, in some ways, makes a little more sense because the lead character is this kind of daredevil, pilot during World War II, and you understand more so why every time he flies off on these missions, and he's somewhat reckless, his girl at home is genuinely terrified. He's not coming back. It makes way more sense in World War II. And so when he dies and then comes back and he's helping this other pilot navigate through battlefields, like it makes sense how he wants to, essentially keep this guy alive during very tense circumstances. So it has that whole kind of heightened drama of that World War II period. I would not say though it's a great movie. I think it has kind of some of the issues that always does, where it's a little bit soggy in the middle half, or in the middle section, I should say. Like it definitely kind of feels a little more dragged out than it should be. And there's some basic mechanics in terms of the way characters are connected in this movie, I think is a problem when it comes to drama. And we'll talk maybe more about that with Always, but it is an issue in that film as well. But I think that one, it has that real, like, it's a 1943 old fashioned black and white movie. There's a certain like sweep to that movie that's just really enjoyable to watch. I would say it's maybe a little bit better, but it's both incredibly similar. Like you could almost map them on top of each other in terms of plot developments, but at the same time, they have kind of a different energy and tone. So that's kind of what's going on there. I think it's really fascinating though that Spielberg and Dreyfuss were so obsessed with this movie because it was like hugely popular in 1943. It was something that I think a lot of wartime audiences looked at as somewhat inspirational. The idea that someone dies in combat but is still looking over, those still going out to fight the good fight. Like I think that would mean something to that audience. But it was not a critical darling. It was very successful, but not a critical darling. And the fact that like Spielberg want to remake it is great. I wish more people would look at flawed movies that maybe didn't deliver 100% and remake those versus something that just was like gangbusters.
Yeah, and I think as well, Victor Fleming directed that, the original, who people will be most familiar probably for Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind. I think he did Joan of Arc as well. And
Mm,
that's a that this then gets into the whole sort of golden age Hollywood, older Hollywoods versus modern day. And I think back then, sort of, I'd say directors not weren't as respected as much, but it was very much the studio system. And also, not that it was easy to make films back then, but you didn't have the concept of an auteur, let alone what we have in modern day and access to histories and decades old and whatnot. So it's a really interesting thing that Spielberg. It's great what it touched upon, that people should remake some of these more flawed films. And this is where the whole studio conversation comes in modern day, is the ones they want to remake were the ones that were already pop. I mean, before we went live, me and you spoke about Jurassic World, and it'll be the last time we bring it up on the channel, I hope, for a while. But it very much was that, people are going to keep watching dinosaurs, and they can keep making them. And is it really the end? Question mark. Because if the new one makes enough money, there's no way they'll want to say we've retired Jurassic Park for good, unless we're going to get a TV series. Who knows? So yeah, Jurassic Park chat gone. We get to talk
mm.
about Jurassic Park in a few weeks, though, ironically, for the Spielberg series. But um, yeah, talking about this, I mean, with the story, because the one thing I was really not, it wasn't a puzzling film, but of my first viewing experience of this, everything was summed up based off finding out that the original was set in World War II.
Hmm.
That why is he so daring for a pilot that's only putting out fires? And listen, it's not to discredit people that have done that, but it's hard to be a daredevil compared to World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not just we've come off the back of Top Gun Maverick, right? So if anyone's going to talk to me about a film about pilots and daredevils, you're thinking of like Maverick or something right now, and it's like he's just putting out fires of John Goodman on to help people, and it's really fascinating thing because as this film comes out of love for the original, not any kind of arrogance of I can do it better. Because some directors do that. And they're like, I love this film, I'm going to remake it now. It's like, but why? If you love it so much, why? Um, and this is where I would say this: one of the biggest plot twists for me in a few years was because I didn't know what the story was about. Was when Richard Dreyfuss' plane blows up. I was like, why has this happened? And I know why
Yeah.
it happened because he went a bit low, but it was such a weird moment for one of the most important scenes of the film. And I was just kind of bemused watching it. Like I was in puzzlement, saying, "What is this?" And again, when you go back to the World War II aspect, I don't know how the scene works. And that I don't know if he's shot down by the pilot, probably more likely, or
It's
something. But
he's shot and I think he's on fire, but they have a target, so he basically drives his plane right into the target.
which would make sense rather than a weird smile to John Goodman and then it just
Yeah.
explodes.
Yeah.
Um, and it was really sad. I'm trying to get Top Gun out of my head now, but they could maybe remake it again, but set it in World War II this time. Who knows? I'm just going to leave that there. Don't keep remaking films, but I'd love to have seen Spielberg. I know this is really unfair because this is sort of it's almost 40 years old, 30 plus years old now, but Spielberg could probably make a fantastic World War II film, which we'll find out in a few years' time in the Steven Spielberg retrospective with stuff like that. And he's done incredible shows, and there's one coming out this year he's executive producing. So it's a really fascinating one. And I kind of guess with this, like, if we're sort of talking about the direction, like, how do you feel with Spielberg's direction in this film? Because I don't think he's directed it poorly. I don't think he's done a bad job. It doesn't feel Spielbergian to a point, and that's a word we've used a lot. I think because I enjoyed Empire of Sin so much last week, I was completely taken away that you had this very much real story that was in a Steven Spielberg film. You could tell that was a Spielberg film. You had that sort of wonder and innocence. Whereas in this, I never felt like I was in a Spielberg film, and not that I was bored, but I just never really felt like I connected with what was going on screen. I'm kind of curious as to sort of your thoughts on that as well.
So I'll start with the Spielberg aspect. It has the sort of nostalgic spirit of Spielberg. Like sometimes Spielberg could be accused of being almost overly earnest, a little overly sentimental at times, especially during this period. This is before he's getting his Oscar for Schindler's
Yeah,
List, where that was kind of the anointment of, okay, we finally will admit you're one of the most important
yeah,
filmmakers today. He fought for that respectability for a long time. And this feels like it's coming out of that period where people who didn't like him, detractors, could say he makes schmaltz. And so it's like you can look at a moment at the end of this film where Holly Hunter and the spirit of Richard Dreyfuss are like flying through the stars, and it's very like E.T. Or there's a moment where Holly Hunter's character has woken up and she's had a premonition something bad could happen, and she's like just basking in orange light, sort of like something you would
yeah.
see in E.T. or
Close
Close
Encounters.
Encounters. Yeah. So there's like little touchstones here and there, but like it doesn't have like distant father figures in it. It doesn't, to the best of my memory, have scenes of flashlights cutting through the dark, through like fog or whatever. Nothing like that. But just in that sort of earnest approach to kind of supernatural type material, yeah, it does have that. But I think for me, where the movie just falls down is that it is Spielberg makes very well-paced movies traditionally. You can
Yeah,
watch almost any of them. Doesn't matter the subject matter. You can watch even something like The Post, for example, and it's paced incredibly well. I find Always incredibly bumpy, and it really wears out its welcome. I find in this, once Richard Dreyfuss' character dies, I think there's two big problems that happen. Number one is that because Richard Dreyfuss is dead and he can't interact with any of the other characters, a lot of the movie is him standing there passively watching things happen. And yes, he can whisper in their ears and they can be inspired, but they don't know it's him. And so there's no real communication. So you see Spielberg bending over backwards to accommodate this. Like they introduce like a homeless character in this who can hear Richard Dreyfuss.
yeah.
It's a terrible scene. but you can tell he's trying to somehow bridge this gap that was a real problem in the original as well. That was a huge issue with the original. And then second of all, you introduce the Brad Johnson playing Ted Baker as this young man who falls in love with Holly Hunter's character. This guy is like a sentient block of wood in this movie. And I
Yeah.
don't get it. Like you've been covering Spielberg movies up until this point, like, from the beginning into always now. Have you encountered another performance in a Spielberg movie this bad?
No, and this is the one thing that surprised me more than anything was that I genuinely thought he was an extra or like an act that's going to have like a scene that's
Yeah.
just not worked. And he kind of reminds of like an action man figure. Like he is built like a unit, but there's nothing there. And the more time you spend with him in the film, I'm just sort of there, like, hold on, like this guy's actually more important and more important. And I'm the more time you spend with him, the less I focus on the plot. And I don't mean this to be unfair to Bradley Johnson. Uh, I don't think this is one of Richard Dreyfuss's best performances as well, but
No.
the gulf in class between acting that stood out horrendously, and credit to Richard Dreyfuss, fine, but it's the first time I'd struggled with. I mean, he's like the main supporting role, and what sort of striking was you get like John Goodman, like in a Spielberg film, who is a bundle of joy in everything I've ever seen him in. He's one of the most charismatic actors that's ever been in the big screen, as far as I'm concerned. And he's great from the time you get with him. And then again, it's then you'll jump to Ted Baker, and also it's How to Take the Name Seriously, the fashion brand. And that's more of a modern eye looking at it as well. But that's not hard from it. But I really struggled with him in this. I know that I don't think they did another film together
No.
after this point. And even back to the framing of the Spielberg stuff, the cinematographer for this was Mikhail Solomon, and he did The Abyss in the same year. Never worked with Spielberg again. One and done. And I don't think this film was particularly well shot. If I'm going to add that too, I know you mentioned some of the stuff as well. The room scenes, they're very much Spielberg things, but the beauty of a Spielberg film is that he just frames everything so well. Whereas I don't think we had that in this film. I can't quite put my finger. Is it the source material? Is it the concept, of the person in the after? Well, it's not the afterlife, but very much in purgatory, guiding them around it. And that's where I kind of struggled with. And even when you've got the action set pieces of the fire, I never feel thrilled by what I'm seeing. Again, is that Top Gun Maverick affecting me? I don't know, but I think everybody on this is capable of more, and I never feel like we had that. And obviously, I'm going to probably moan about it next week, but Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade has a phenomenal plane sequence. And it's kind of their like same year. And okay, it's going to be a bit different budget wise, action wise, and everything. But it's kind of, it couldn't be more opposite. Whereas certain directors, if they have similar scenes in other films, you'd always clock it on the spot. It will feel familiar. And Empire of the Sun last week, again, that's got plane sequences, and they stood out. They were shot perfectly. And it's a real struggle with this, if I'm being honest, because I was invested in. I mean, if we sort of slowly move on to the characters, Pete and Dorinda, you kind of said that I was invested in Richard Dreyfuss. I was invested in Pete. I'd liked the idea that okay, I don't believe he's a daredevil to a point, but you get the fantastic scene with Holly Hunter when she speaks about every time he comes back, she doesn't think she'll see him again, and he agrees we'll start away and move new life. It's really obviously probably would have died at that point. Again, I didn't clock it for some reason. I thought this was just going to be like a stale drama afterwards,
Mm.
and he'd be called back into action. And obviously, then the explosion happened. And as you said, when he's dead, he can't communicate. I'm just kind of trapped as a viewer alongside him. And even like Audrey Hepburn, this being her final film, I know she went on record and said it was that she wanted to work with Spielberg, which I completely understand.
Yeah.
And that's what I know what you spoke about then with the didn't get his full recognition until after the Oscars and stuff, which is true. There's a really good interview I'm going to speak of in the Hook interview where he basically gives a tour of his place, and he's basically just honest and says they don't rate me because I've done blockbusters. Essentially, he's a really passionate speech. He's not being rude. He's not sort of moaning. He's just calling them out for it, and it's a stone cold fact. And you watch that clip for people at home. I'll link it near the time. That year he then wins an Oscar for Genesis, which makes that clip even better. But yeah, jumping into the characters. I mean, how do you feel with Pete and Dorinda? I know it's sort of unfair to group them together, but again, I think it's what makes Ted Baker look worse that I can see the chemistry with those two, and then for Ted Baker to be the love interest, I'm like, what? How's this got here? And even he was trying to make a move on her at the dance scene, I was just kind of uncomfortably there. Like, is this like? It felt like one of those films like you'd get a character that might sexually assault someone, and I think the performance was that bad. I felt like it was going to be something as uncomfortable as that, and it wasn't. And that's definitely not the intention. But that's how I felt like as a viewer. Is that a bit extreme of me? I don't know how you read their sort of romantic moments.
Well, I mean, I'll just speak to the Ted Baker stuff first. Like, I co-host a Star Trek podcast called Subspace Transmissions, and when we cover a lot of the stuff like TNG or DS9, we talk a lot about how at that point in time they were always looking for '90s guy. It's this generic guy from the '90s. They've all got similar, usually brown hair, and there's a look, and that is what Brad Johnson has in this movie. And so I can understand why you would think he was almost an extra, and the way they just have him kind of creeping around is weird. In the original, they introduce that character later in the movie. He's like a young pilot. We don't have him hanging around. He kind of runs into, the female lead Irene Dunn by circumstance. It's not like him just mooning over her in the background the way they do Brad Johnson. I guess they felt with a remake they wanted to have that character in theory have a connection with the audience earlier, but I don't think it works. And you're right, like the romantic couple in this movie, they have like a bantering chemistry, just as Irene Dunn and Spencer Tracy did, where it's this real back and forth. There's a competitive side, and you also really get the underlining that the male protagonist is really flawed, like very very stubborn, does not listen. You have a scene where she's just like pleading with him to basically be safe. She's like, I'd like you to take a teaching position and I'll come with you, or, just like leave the air, or if you stay in the air, sorry, I'm going to leave you. And he's like, nope, neither one's acceptable. And it's like, it's really just like, oof, like you can feel that. And I honestly think, like, I don't know that Richard Dreyfuss and Holly Hunter, it's like they have chemistry, but they are a weird mismatched duo in the movie. But I genuinely think Holly Hunter carries this movie on her
Yeah,
shoulders. Like, because you have a scene where she shows up in like a dress, and it is a movie star moment. Like, it is a show stopping, like, who is this movie star that just walked into the movie kind of scene. You have a musical number where they're dancing to Ask Me How I Know, which is weirdly reminiscent of Ghost, which would come 1 year later with the musical
yeah,
number there. But every moment they ask Holly Hunter to have a scene where she is essentially sensing Richard Dreyfuss, she is selling the hell out of it. So it's like, you're asking me to buy the scenes with her and Dreyfuss. I do, because I can see she's emoting so much, and then you put her opposite Brad Johnson, and she's just blowing him completely off the screen.
yeah. I keep going back to what we said about the '90s guy. Um, he reminded me of Mike from Karate Kid 3. Like, and
Yeah.
it's probably not far off in years, if I'm being honest as well, like around the time. And it's that kind of, they've got the jock, but the jock's in an integral role, which I never saw coming. And I think it is a very 90s thing because it's really unfair. And we're going very late in the 90s, but George the Jungle, you've got the guy that played Sandman. I always forget his name. I'm going to get
Thomas
mixed up
Hayden
as well.
Church.
Thomas Hayden Church. I think Thomas Ian Church is from Karate Kid. I was trying to make sure I didn't say the wrong one, but it is a very 90s thing. Now you've kind of said it. I've never thought about it in that way, but it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the stoic, evil male love interest type thing, and it was
Usually
overdone.
bland. Usually they're kinda
Yes,
bland. Yeah.
and that's the purpose of them as well, is to be bland, that you're going to align with the protagonist. And in this film, you're meant to be accepting him becoming the new love interest. You've got to accept the fact that Richard Dreyfuss is happy for him to be the love interest, and I never got that. And it's just this is Holly Hunter's film. Every great moment, essentially performance wise, comes through her. It's with her interactions with people, even in the final scenes when it's under the water. I think she's the best thing in this by a country mile. And I think she's got, you mentioned she had great chemistry with everyone, even like when she's got scenes with John Goodman and they're both in mourning. It just carries it. Everyone she's with carries it further. And I've not actually seen that many of her films. I'm not just going to say The Incredibles because that's really unfair, or even Batman v Superman, that's even worse. But I know she obviously won Oscars in the 90s as well, and she's a very successful career. And it's a really interesting one. And as to what you said, oh, she has that star power when she comes down the stairs, and that's one of the first times we really get to see her blossom, and it builds up their relationship that she doesn't want to wear it before. She doesn't want to open the present, and it's a really interesting back and forth with them. And that's what makes it even weirder is when you get to the end, we've got this newfound relationship, and there's just it doesn't feel like there's anything there. It's so I think you said bland. Bland is probably the only polite term to really use for it because I feel, and this is so unfair on the actual Ted Baker, but if you have a charismatic actor or written better at that point, I think you've got a completely different film. I just think is it the performance that's gone wrong, or is it the direction for that performance that's gone wrong? And that's where I've kind of come in because it's not like Spielberg to normally get the tone or slightly casting gone wrong. And if I'm going to be blunt, I'm trying to think of film since. There's obviously that with a recency bias, you've got West Side Story with Ansel Elgort for many different reasons other than his private life, and it's
Mm.
another. You've got this charismatic, great debut performance as well, and then you've got this horrifically bland actor who can't sing, working with everyone that's trained in musical theatre, which exposed it even worse. And it doesn't happen often with Spielberg films, but as anyone can say, it can happen. I don't think there's probably has there ever been a director that's ever not cast one role wrong. Certainly in an illustrious
Oof.
50+ year career, probably not. And I think everyone's going to do it, and I'm going to be really polite and say I'd rather it was in this film than any of the other ones that come down the line. Um,
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
bit. Is that too harsh?
It's really well, it's frustrating because I'm with you. Like I don't like to bag on actors in general because like an actor ultimately falls victim to so many things. The script, the way they're being directed, the takes that are chosen by the editor. Like they have to go through so many steps before we're like, "Oh, they were amazing." Well, it's like, boy, like it's tough for an actor I think to often get across what they're actually striving for because there's so many barriers to prevent it. I just think this is a case of fatal miscasting because like Richard Dreyfuss, while you may look at him and Holly Hunter together and be like, I don't know that I quite buy them as a couple, Dreyfuss has charisma to spare.
Yeah,
And if you want Holly Hunter to live happily ever after with this, guy she meets after Dreyfuss has passed, you have to, I think, care about him and like him. Like you want to see her go off happily with this person. And it's just I think they were maybe taking a gamble on an unknown. They thought it would be interesting to
yeah,
instead of bringing in, a young star of that particular time period of 1990, it was like, well, let's bring in an unknown because it's kind of like Richard Dreyfuss is kind of lifting this guy up for the audience, as opposed to if it's someone known, you don't buy as much Dreyfuss lifting him up. But it's a mix of like a very specific tone, a very like old fashioned melodrama that the guy just can't really work within. And just, I think it's miscasting.
yeah. It's like a gamble that you can see the logic of and why.
Mm,
As you said, they're lifting him up, or they need that tonal change that you're going from this chaotic character with Rich Dreyfuss, this daredevil, to somebody who is very safe, who isn't going to be like that. But then even that doesn't work in its own right. And yeah, I don't think it's Bradley Johnson's fault. I think there's so many other varying factors, which is probably the best way to do it as well. And I kind of touch upon you as well the Audrey Hepburn stuff.
yeah.
Was there a similar character in the original? Because it felt very the whole haircut barber scene felt very weird. And watching it for the first time, I was just kind of here like I was like, I didn't see a parachute. What on earth is going on? Then you realize moments
Yeah.
like, okay, he's dead and he's a spirit now. And again, because I didn't know that heading in, that made that experience so weird. But obviously, the gravitas of Audrey Hepburn. How did you find that? Because it's a very odd role, if I'm going to be honest.
It is an invention for this movie. That's not the case in the original. What happens is when Spencer Tracy blows up, he basically wakes up and he is basically reporting to a military base. And it's essentially like the military men who have died still kind of live in this in between world. And he's checking in and they're giving him orders and saying, we want you to go shadow this other pilot. He has other officers that are with him that he'll, sometimes talk to. He'll have scenes actually talking to these deceased, officers. So it's very much grounded in his world. It would be like if this movie, if Richard Dreyfuss had died and met up with other fire pilots who'd passed away. That's kind of what the original's doing. They don't do that. They instead create this kind of magical being, this Audrey Hepburn character, which I feel like it's so, we've talked about Spielberg miscasting someone and possibly directing someone to a poor performance. But I also feel like I've never seen Spielberg biff like fantasy before until this movie,
Yeah,
where the Audrey Hepburn moments should feel like magical, and they kind of don't. They feel kind of weird. I like the idea of her as this sort of supernatural figure. She's a perfect casting choice for that. But those scenes when she's like giving him a haircut and stuff, you can totally imagine those working in another movie.
yeah. Another of his movies as well. It's the tone
Yeah.
of what these, and it's did it come for him writing a role for her? Was that the conversation preluding, or was it he'd wrote? Well, I know he didn't write this as such, but was it his film where he had this idea for a character and it was Audrey Hepburn audition for it? That's because it feels like the sort of tug of war where it's very common for directors to want to work with actors and they'll write roles for them to get the guarantee they'll come in. And I absolutely love it when directors do it, but it does feel very, and as you said, it doesn't feel magical. It's like there's almost like a weird filter on the screen, and it's not this sort of mystic. I know a really weird comparison, but when you first meet, oh god, Kate Blanchett in Lord of the Rings, what's the character's name?
Oh, Galadriel, something like that.
Galadriel, that's it. When she comes on screen, you've got almost like a white glow with her, and it's that kind of fantasy thing that you would assume she'd have, but it just felt like was she in the forest, because it doesn't feel like anything's changed, and it's relying on so much exposition for it. And I think that's where the struggle is. You're relying on the exposition. You're not seeing it. You're not believing it. You're just being told it. And I think that can be a struggle for a lot of films, especially again. I think maybe we expect in a high regard because it's Spielberg, because we know what he is capable of. And certainly with his last few films, we've seen him move from those blockbuster types into the dramas, which he's done phenomenal jobs with. And then it feels like almost not a step backwards doing always, but it's clearly a passion project of his. This film is a passion project for him, for Dreyfuss. And to me, did the passion get in the way of the quality? That sounds horrific, and I don't mean if that sounds as bad as it does. But I'm on this toe of saying the concept is there for a good film. But I don't think it's had the execution. Whereas if I was going to pick any director out of probably 1,000 to get a solid outing of a concept, it's probably Spielberg. Like he makes the impossible very possible. Demonstrated stuff like Jaws, E.T., Jurassic Park, and so many others that followed since.
It almost feels like he was almost too reverential to the original, that I just wonder if he should have shaken it up a lot. I don't even know that the central concept works that well, as we've talked about, where like your lead character is just standing watching things happen. Like I don't know that it seems to work well in comedies. You watch things like, Heaven Can Wait, Here Comes Mr. Jordan, which were, those are the same movie. They remade Here Comes Mr. Jordan into Heaven Can Wait, and then again into Down to Earth with Chris Rock. So they've done it a few times, but I feel like the concept of someone who's died and is watching things happen in a comedy is funny. Like they can kind of, observe things that are happening and make quips and what have you. There's some comedy to that. Whereas in a drama, I don't know. Like I think it's really tough to really mine genuine pathos when a character is just standing there. There's moments like when Dreyfuss, realizes that Holly Hunter's character is falling for Brad Johnson. He has a moment where you can tell he's just gutted and he's like, why am I here? Why do I have to watch this? You get that sort of stuff and it kind of works. But I often feel like with this one, Spielberg's also kind of almost, it seems like he's almost having an argument with himself, like just give them what they expect from you. Because the fantasy stuff, he doesn't feel like he's fully engaged with it, but he feels like he has to do it. And like the action scenes, which you touched on, all the pilot mist stuff with fighting the fires, they're not particularly memorable set pieces. And you could almost just do them as shorthand because they're not that big a deal within the context of the movie. But it's almost like he's like, well, the audience expects me to do really impressive, you know, forest fire sequences, so I better do those. But I don't know, does he feel as engaged with, like, any of the effects stuff in this movie as any of, like, the Indiana Jones chase sequences or anything? It doesn't seem like it.
And this is kind of where I'm at, and I don't know if this sounds unfair. With this film, more than anything, with it being so close to Indiana Jones, uh, does it have that effect of was his mind elsewhere potentially when filming started, or did he try and be like, I don't want it to be like Indiana Jones? And it's that thing that where at the end of the day, it's a credit to him. Not many directors can drop two films in a year, and he's done it several times in his career. And 93 is obviously the best one of all of those, probably in history, that any director will ever do that. Ironically, the guy that did the original dropped Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind in the same year, which is probably, you could have a debate with that, which was
Although
a nice little tale to.
to be fair, there was something like 7 directors on each of those movies.
Yeah, in that studio system as well. I've just been trying to scan very quickly to detract. Has Spielberg made an outright fantasy film before? And the only thing I can consider, I haven't actually seen this ironically yet. I'm a massive fan of the author. Is the BFG in 2016?
Right. I mean, you could
Is that
Hook for sure.
cool? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I didn't really see. Yeah, okay, ignore me. Hook is the obvious one, and that's gonna come in a few weeks' time as a plug. But and I really like Hook as a side piece, but it's interesting because I guess you could say as well, Tinkerbell in that film is I've forgotten her name.
Oh, Julia
What's
Roberts.
yeah, and feels very similar to Audrey Hepburn in this. It's that mystical guy. I know that obviously Tinkerbell is, but I remember again I've not seen it in many years, which I'm really looking forward actually to the rewatch soon. There are certain moments of this that feel like that, but I think Hook he's got it. But he's never. I guess when I mean fantasy, delve into that extreme fantasy of not like a Lord of the Rings, but you know where I'm going. Doing like the I guess you could say the stereotypical fantasy films. He's
Yeah.
never really done it, which you'd think. But at the end of the day, I mean, he's only just done his first musical, and that's one of the best films of his career. Many could argue now as well. So it is fascinating with him, and yeah, if I'm gonna jump aside as well, I want to talk about John Williams in this film because I love
Yeah.
John Williams. We say every week it's kind of not become a boring segment, but nobody doesn't like John Williams. If they were, they would be on the channel. I'm just going to say that actually. Um, what do you think of the score for this? Because I mean, again, on a first viewing, to me personally, it's harder to take in scores,
Yeah.
especially with a John Williams score, but because he's got this quality that he's so above the average composer. Even him at arguably an average score is probably going to be better than most could do in their lifetime if they really wanted to. And as well as editing the intro for this, I was going for some things. I think, you know what, there's a pretty good score here, but I just didn't really get it in the film. And I know that I guess the big moment is actually the singing scene as well. So it's not really John Williams' score. So how do you feel with that? Is that me being a bit unfair on John Williams? I didn't mean it in that regard.
No, I think you're being pretty fair, and I'm a big John Williams fan myself as well. I actually just 2 nights ago saw Return of the Jedi live with the orchestra doing the
Ooh,
score, which was phenomenal experience. But um,
did they do
I
Jedi Rock?
actually, hmm?
Did they do Jedi Rocks?
No, the orchestra just had to sit silently and take in Jedi Rocks the way all of us did. But it was interesting just to hear an orchestra do that end Ewok song. You know, the revised orchestra because
The
I just was thinking to
victory
myself.
celebration.
Yeah, because I was just thinking to myself, like, never again in my life will I sit and hear an orchestra perform the end revised Ewok music from Return of the Jedi. I'm sure I'll hear the Star Wars score played live again in my lifetime, but probably not that piece. But as for John Williams in this movie, I actually made a note where it just says John Williams is really trying to do the heavy lifting here because this is a score. It feels a little bit generic John Williams to me.
Yeah.
There's a few moments where you can just tell he's going for that fashioned melodrama, just this huge sweeping score moments. But the score is also accompanying moments where you're not feeling any real drama. So it really feels like if you're a composer, ultimately, it so much depends on the material. You can take the greatest composer in the world, hand them Jurassic Park Fallen Kingdom, and what are you going to get? Right? Like, okay, well, I got to work with what I get. Um, and that's kind of the case here where he's bringing up, some lovely notes and everything. But if the movie's not working, there's only so much he can do. And like you, it's weird. This was actually the third time I'd seen Always, was to watch it for this and for the show. And when it was over, I couldn't remember the score. So, that's a third time.
Yeah, and I think as well, sometimes you can think, oh, okay, it's because John Williams has done so much across his career, but with this, it feels like not even blended; it's sort of just dropped out of the mind,
Mm.
and that hasn't happened a lot. Empire of the Sun had a few moments like that, but obviously the core of that film, it's not the kind of film that needs this riveting score. That's a very when that film needed its score for the plane scene, you got the score, and I just think in this you get these big moments, and it's like, oh, they're just putting out a fire, and again it goes back to the plot of the film. Like it's so not ridiculous, but I guess contextually in 1989, unless you were going to set it in Vietnam in the 70s, there's probably really not much you could
Well,
do. Is
I
that
had a
sound unfair?
question. No, no, I had a question for you actually in regards to that because yeah, when you're watching it, you're just like, I mean, I know that like putting out fires, through a plane is dangerous. Being it like a pilot on those forest fire missions would be dangerous. But I don't think every time a pilot takes off, they're like, he may not be coming back this time. I just don't think
No.
that's the case. But I was wondering, and I made a note about this as well, because I was questioning, like, why? Why is it forest fires? And I'm wondering if they were trying to avoid comparisons to Top Gun, which was made 3 years earlier.
Oh, that's a very good point. That's a very good point, actually, because I mean, if you wanted to play Kenny Loggins in this, it might have improved it, maybe. No, that's
Yeah.
actually a fantastic point because yeah, I guess if you had them doing anything similar to that, you would then. I mean, we're making Top Gun comparisons. I know it's just come out, but
Mhm.
they'd have done the same thing in '89 as '86, wouldn't they? I'm trying to think. Were there any other? When did I know Hot Shots are parodies, but do you remember their release years as well, or the '90s or late '80s? I can't remember, but
Like,
I
do you
wonder
mean
if
like
the
knockoffs of Top Gun or?
yeah, the parody ones, because I know that some studios get funny with parodies, don't they, as well,
Yeah.
and their impact culturally.
I don't know
But,
if there was parodies of Top Gun at that point, but there was a bunch of Top Gun knockoffs. So like things like Firebirds was, I'm sure, in at least development around the time of this. There was a number of plane movies that all came out. The Iron Eagle series, things like that.
and that maybe backs into this as well. Is this maybe the reason why the opportunity came to remake the film? Because the one thing I've not seen a lot of when I was doing a bit of research today was the point of them saying. I mean, I guess nowadays we have article after article on any film that gets rebooted. We know all the rights and who owns them and who doesn't and stuff. But with them, the conversation. I know that MGM did the original, but they've had to get MGM rights from the studio. I know that Universal did this release as well. It's been tricky finding information about how this came into production and could it have also
Yeah.
been off the back of Top Gun as well? Like, hey, we've got this Steven Spielberg wants to do a film about a daring pilot. Studios could be like, yeah, go for it, mate. And then they might have said something that goes, fires, like forest fires. And it's a very good question. And I guess, like, again, now contextually in 2022, that's a fantastic question because we're going to have, I guarantee you right now, in the next 3 years, we are going to get some more plane films. And people have completely misinterpreted why Top Gun Maverick worked. And it wasn't because of the planes, it was because of the story
Well,
and
it's funny, a
characters.
connection to Always too, like, sort of the Spielberg, connection. Spielberg was developing a DC Comics property. I can't remember the name of it, but it's about planes. It's about pilots doing, like, high-tech plane missions, and I was wondering after seeing Top Gun: Maverick if it's like, "Oh, that may get the green light now."
You know what? Even if he doesn't do it, probably if it's sat there in a back door in a studio, they'll be like, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And I think what's going to be mega. I know we spoke about earlier very quickly. Masters of the Air this year is going to be massive.
Mhm.
And now I wonder if Top Gun might give it a bit of free advertising in its own way. Obviously, they've got some behind the scenes stuff that's going to probably be at the forefront with Kerry Fukunaga, which is horrific. Not
Yeah.
what he's done, not in anything else regard. So that series I've been very excited for, and obviously Spielberg's got an executive producer credit on there as well with Tom Hanks. And obviously they actually filmed it not far from where I live, which is really cool as well. But yeah, it's a really fascinating point. Actually, I never really thought of that, and I guess it is that there is the knock-on factor. And you know, I know that nowadays people speak about these directors that can't get the funding for films,
Mhm.
and guess Spielberg was the big name, but there would have even been times Spielberg was probably told no at the height of his powers. And we know the same thing happens now. And obviously, and Amblin was around back then, but again, they wouldn't have had that industry dominance they have today of the we can not do whatever we want. But if Spielberg wants to make something, you'll at least get the. I think the Halo series was always the thing that's officially out now. He's not involved, but that was always going to be the Spielberg Halo film
Mm.
at one point, I think. And a lot of his projects that are rumored and are left on that dining room table end up getting made down the line. And it's a really interesting conversation actually with that sort of stuff. If we're speaking about this film, though, I mean, talking about the legacy of this film, the impact, its box office made $74 million. Contextually for 1989, that's not bad. I can't even
Yeah.
find the budget information, but it would have been fine. Not a problem. That obviously wouldn't have been the height that Indiana Jones and Last Crusade makes. Of course, it wouldn't be like that. 1989 was a pretty incredible year. Actually, you got Batman coming out. You've got I know Bombs. You got License to Kill. Going off something we spoke about before. I think you ran our review for that one. And a lot of 1989. I think Ghostbusters 2 came
Yep.
out.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
there's a few others in my head I'm thinking of, and you know I wouldn't say this film is Oscar bait. I don't. Oscar bait is
Well,
such a fascinating thing 'cause
yeah.
I don't think the term was around then is more where I'm coming from. But
No.
on paper, on paper, this would be dubbed as an Oscar film, I'd imagine, and it never not a single nomination, and that's also not very surprising to me. I mean, he made a better film in the same year that probably did get a lot of nominations and maybe a couple of wins as well. And how do you feel? I mean, even just asking the question, how is it perceived today? Have you ever spoken to anyone about Always for more than 50 minutes like we've done tonight?
No. Always is a movie that, like, I just think almost anyone I know, even people who are really into movies, have just it's the Spielberg movie that no one, I don't think, talked about after, like, 1991 or whenever it came out first on video. It just kind of disappeared, and it doesn't even feel like one that had a life on TV. One of those movies that just got played over and over again and amassed an audience through that. It doesn't even feel like that kind of movie. It just quietly arrived, made, you know, okay money and disappeared.
I'm I can tell you that it's been released on Blu-ray,
Mhm.
but it's at a premium price, which means that this was discontinued, which normally means that they made very few of them or they just discontinued it for obvious selling reasons. And yeah, it's a very weird one of this because as you said, no one spoke about it. And again, it's not an arrogance thing to say I've never heard of it. It's you look at his run of films in the 80s, and it's the one that no one spoke about. And you know, going back to Sugarland Express, that was his second film. That's completely understandable why not many
Yeah.
people would have spoke about it. So it's pre-Jaws, and we sort of said at the time it's because it's in between Jaws and Duel. It's like it's the second film, isn't it? You've had your debut, and then you've got your mega hit, which is the third one. And whereas with this, it's in a very weird predicament. And what I kind of want to say as well, like I mean, talking like favorite scenes. Do you have any favorite scenes? I I didn't mind some scenes, but I can't say I was ever wowed by any others.
For me, it's, the Holly Hunter moment in the dress and then the dance that jumps out. And then that moment I touched on earlier where, like, Richard Dreyfuss has, like, the real broken moment. But
Yes.
even, like, a moment that I feel we should both be, like, singing to the heavens about is the moment where Richard Dreyfuss says goodbye and he's in the back of the plane. And I'm like, "Eh, it's okay." Like, I could be, like, a total sap for those types of moments in movies. You put on, like, Ghost and Mrs. Muir is, like, a movie that I absolutely love, an older film with Gene Tierney and Rex Harrison, and I will be a mess every time I get to the end. It's also like a supernatural romance film, and it just hits a home run with me over and over again. And I sit through this scene in Always, and I'm like, "Okay." And it's like the original has a very similar ending where I'm like, "This farewell speech is going on too long, and it's not hitting the right chords, Like, it's not hitting that emotional punch that I really need it to."
Yeah. It's kind of like satisfying, but it shouldn't be satisfying. It should be what makes the film. It should be the moment for the film. But
Yeah.
it's as you said, it's just like, okay, it's happened. And now they're together and he's left her and it's all this. And yeah, it leaves me quite cold. And I think it's because I think Spielberg of all directors he is one of the masters at these relationships, whether it's absent fathers, kids, aliens, museums, architects, everything. Like he can create relationships and believable relationships on screen that you can understand. And I just don't feel like there's any emotional resolution for us as a viewer, which
I'm
is
back.
the weirdest point.
I'm backtracking now. You've been covering all the Spielbergs. Had he done like a real romance before?
Sugarland Express,
Yeah. I mean,
if that can, I don't see it as a romance film, but I feel like that's the
it's more
closest film of
grounded.
his.
It's more grounded.
Yeah,
Like this is like a melodrama.
he hasn't done a drama to this degree. Certainly not of a relationship. Uh, I think I'm scanning in my head now as well. I kind of wish I had the schedule. I don't think he has. If I'm going to be absolutely blunt, I think this is the first time. Yeah, because we spoke about Color Purple was almost his first drama per se. Then
Yeah.
it's Empire of the Sun, and then it's this. And I don't think we've had it. No, we've not had one prior to this. And I
The
mean, I'm
Indiana
trying to think.
Jones, like Indiana Jones, the first couple have like romantic moments, but they aren't these sweeping romances. And you can say there's like a romance in like Terminal later down the road. But at this point, he wasn't really known for like genuine romance, and that's what this movie depends on.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of in a really smart way. Looking like ahead, it's something that I think he starts to nurture in the not 90s, but I think there's a point of his career which is around the time Hook comes out where I think he spoke quite honestly that because he's had kids, he's got a very different input on life. And obviously, I mean, Schindler's List is like an understatement, so that have had an impact on him as well.
Hmm.
I think after those key points, his style of filmmaking completely changes. Not in a bad way. It's evolution as every director will go through. Again, who's had long term careers that don't just do the same film for 30 years. And West Side Story, you could argue, and to recency bias again, the weakest point of that film is the core relationship, and that's down to a miscasting, which is arguably very similar to this one. Meanwhile, you've got another relationship in the film which is superb, which is again probably because they've actually got proper actors. But yeah, it's a very good question, and that's one I'll probably actually be keeping out because it's one of the beauty of the Spielberg films is as we sort of move out of the 80s and get into that 90s, his style does change and evolve. And yeah, that's just quite a good question. I'm trying to think of even the relationships in his 90s films that you get to see, and
Yeah,
I've never seen Amistad. I
there's
know that's not about relationships in that degree. That's about slavery.
he's better at like kind of suggestions of affection and things like Jurassic Park with Sadler and
Yeah,
Grant. Like moments like that work. The Indiana Jones stuff works because it's pulp storytelling kind of romance. Um, this may be a weak spot for him because unless I'm forgetting something, I can't think of like the sweeping romance he's delivered that just, as you said, West Side Story is a fantastic movie, but the romance is probably the most unconvincing part of the whole thing.
yeah.
And that may just be something he's not great at. I mean, we may have found something that Spielberg can't hit a home run time and time again at.
Yeah, maybe his next film will be something. I mean, Fabelmans is a family film, so we know exactly what we're going to get with that, with himself growing up. But that's a very good point. I'm being numb because I'm just trying to think about. I'm trying to think of all the films that are upcoming, and even as you said with Indiana Jones, a lot of his relationships in films are very much the stereotype protagonist falls for female love interest, and there's nothing wrong with that, and he does that a hell of a lot. But you never outright had a relationship drama romance film, and maybe that's why. Maybe that's something he maybe knows himself as a director that he isn't confident doing. Maybe which is something we'd all be surprised by. Again, doing a musical for the first time last year, which was phenomenal. But
Mhm.
yeah, and has he done horror? I know he was involved in Poltergeist. It's not. He's
You
never
can
done
look at moments like the Shining sequence in Ready Player One, or
War
just
of the
some of the
Worlds.
kind
There's a
of the
few.
horror elements. Yeah, War of the Worlds is a great example, and also even like Close Encounters has the scene with the little
Yes,
boy. That's pretty horrific.
but he's never. And I'll say this to sort of criticize myself. I hate the trope that people say. I think because of Chris Nolan, I'm going to get into it. But everyone's like they have to do a horror film once in their career. And they say about Tarantino, they said about Nolan, this Spielberg, and because they did do horror doesn't mean they dislike it. It's just I'm not gonna be arrogant and say they're gonna rise up with it either, but it's doing a horror film is very different to what these guys probably want to do, and probably what they're also capable of doing without also sounding very rude. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so it's been quite fun. I mean, we've just hit an hour, which I did not think we'd get to. So I'm gonna enjoy this. But if we're heading into our final thoughts each, it's been a bit of a weird one to summarize because I'm going to be quite blunt and say I think this is probably my least favorite film of his so far on this series. So
What
what
about
I've got going on,
1941? What about 1941
oh,
there?
but I can understand.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, that's a very good point. Actually, 1941, I hated. I think because of where he's at in his career with Always is more of a struggle knowing where he's at. I mean, in 1941, he's just come off the back of Jaws and Close Encounters, but um, I think for a film like Always, I think maybe it's because I know that he's capable of doing this better.
Mhm.
Whereas 1941, it feels like the complete opposite of what I would expect from Spielberg. Like Spielberg doing a wartime slapstick comedy. I understand why he did it with his history and his fascination with World War II.
Yeah.
But that's young filmmakers got the world at their shoulders and try something that doesn't work. Whereas with this one, I'm a bit mellow, I'm a bit hollow with it, and I'm also just kind of sat there saying like Indiana Jones is coming up soon, and it's going to get back on track. I don't know. It's not the kind of film that's going to torment or ruin any director's career. Maybe it's just a film that just doesn't work. And that's why, as we said, is it miscasting? I don't know. Is it the story? Is it the era of the film setting? I'm really curious about this Top Gun comments now. I'd love to try and find out a bit more about how and why this film came to be in 1989 of all the years.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's my kind of final thoughts. It's a weird one. It's like I don't want to be too harsh on it because I think the logic's there to do this film. The the love's there for the original from him, but it just maybe that's why it doesn't work still to me. Maybe he's so engrossed in what he grew up with, what he liked previously. I don't know. It's a very weird amalgamation, isn't it? I can't quite put my finger on why it doesn't work for me, and that's probably the best summary I have.
Yeah, like it's a very messy movie, and not messy in a way like, the I don't know, theatrical cut of Batman v Superman is, where you can tell it's just like been hacked to shreds and reassembled. It's messy in a way where it feels like the story just got away from him at times. It feels like it's meandering in weird places. And that's some of that is from the source material. Like the original also does meander quite a bit as well. Um, but it just feels like a movie that he didn't have a strong angle on. And that's something I genuinely find with Spielberg. When he makes something, whether you like the finished product or not, it kind of stands on its own and it's just really your response to it. And this one, it feels soggy. And that's not something I expect Spielberg to make, kind of like a movie that comes out half baked. It feels like no matter what he's making, it's still going to be something that I can look at and say whether it works or not for me. But clearly, Spielberg had a vision for this that he was delivering on. This one, I don't know that he had a vision for it really. And I wonder how much of it was just Dreyfuss desperately wanted to make this movie again. I think Richard Dreyfuss had seen it like 35 times, the original. And I wonder if it was like the two of them are friends. Dreyfuss has said, I would love to do this with you. That sounds great. I get to work with my friend and make this movie. And this was the result. So it's a
Yeah,
movie I can't recommend to really anyone as like the lost Spielberg that you are going to love. But I would kind of recommend it to people as a curiosity of we tend to look at every Spielberg movie as an event. Everything he puts out is a huge deal and we need to kind of bow down to those movies when they come out and are released, and even when you look back, you're going Jaws, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., nothing but hits. It's actually interesting, I think, to go back and watch a movie like Always at one where it feels like he's struggling a little bit.
yeah, I think that's a really good time. Struggling a bit as well with it. It's an interesting one because I wouldn't say if you're going through all his films, then 100% watch it. If this is one of the ones you haven't seen, just watch out of curiosity. I think curiosity is probably almost the description for it because there's a reason why you haven't probably been told to watch it or people speak about it. When people speak about Richard Dreyfuss Spielberg films, this isn't going to be number one or two for many obvious reasons. And
Hmm.
that's kind of where it is with it. As you said, is it the friendship that got the film made? Because that is also a common factor in films. That happens with a lot with actors and directors in it. Yeah, there's some fascinating behind the scenes that needs to be mined out, but there's also a great reason why none of that's ever been also mined out, is that there's not much to it. I don't know. It's a weird one, and it's a weird way to end the episode, because I think it's the first time we've had this. It's like an intrigue. Is this an intrigue at what not went wrong, but it's an intrigue at the final product, and we've not had that before, which kind of makes it exciting. But with that being said, we want to hear from you. If you're a fan of Always, please comment below. If you've seen Always, definitely please comment below. But where do you sort of stand on the film? Anything like that? Or if you're a fan of Spielberg, have we been harsh on some of his direction capabilities? I'm really curious to see if anyone has seen this, just because, yeah, it's a weird one. So get the comments going if you do see this. Very intrigued by that. And as well, if you're a fan of Spielberg, as we said, this is the place to be. There's a lot of Spielberg films coming out. Next week, next Tuesday, the 21st of June, there'll be a review on the channel for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which is going to be so much fun. Not to say I haven't had fun tonight, but getting to watch that film again for the first time in a few years is going to be really exciting. So I'm very much looking forward to that one. We're going to be joined by both Toms, Tom Butler and Tom Woods, who've both on the channel before. So I need to make sure I can get their names right in the actual episode. And, if you want to have a look at what's coming up, not just Indiana Jones, but looking ahead to the future, we have Hook coming on the 28th of June, Jurassic Park on the 5th of July, Schindler's List the 12th of July. Maybe that's the greatest full image run of one director. I'm sure there's probably others that have had stuff up there, but that, I mean, it's more the last two more than anything, isn't it? Just those two, that fact they came back to back in the same year is still the most extraordinary story in cinema to me. I think the classic Spielberg quote is, Monday to Friday he was filming Auschwitz. At the weekend he was looking at CGI dinosaurs, and no wonder he really struggled with that. That's just insane to comprehend for anybody. So that's going to be fun to a degree, talking about that on Schindler's List. And all these other films. So again, if you're a fan of Spielberg, do stick around. There's a lot of stuff happening on the channel. If you want to find out about other videos we've got coming up on the channel, we always announce on social media. It's Twitter and Instagram at cinema_savvy, Facebook and letterboxd.com/cinema savvy. Redbubble link in the description below for a description. I was going to say, I feel like I need to make some Spielberg merch or do something. I don't know if I'll get copyright strikes. Who knows? But maybe
Don't
there'll be
make
something
Always
down the
shirts.
line.
Do not make an
Oh,
Always shirt. You won't make anything.
maybe we'll be the one place that has the Always shirt, and that'll be the goal, is to find someone else with one. And Cam as well. We've also got SpyHards, so we've got a link in the description below to the link tree that's got them all on there, and social media can get you on at SpyHards. What episode have you got coming up soon for people at home? I know you've just
We
started one of the new Bond eras.
Yeah, we did the Brosnan era, we did the Connery era, and now we're doing kind of the oddities. So we put out our Casino Royale 1967. We are going to be releasing Never Say Never Again fairly soon, and we'll also have interviews with two of the writers on that film, as well as Barbara Carrera, who played Fatima Blush. So that's kind of the big stuff. We've also put out an episode of a Jason Bourne roundtable where we gathered up some guests. We have an editor who works in the film industry, and we had a stunt and action expert come on and join us to break down the Bourne franchise and just look at what makes it so special, what's its context within spy cinema and action cinema, and how did it change the way movies are made.
Definitely. So everybody, please check out the Jason Bourne stuff. I've not seen him in a long time. I really should. I haven't seen the fourth or fifth one, which is the ones
Common.
that shouldn't have, yeah, very common. And you got
Yeah.
the, oh my god, it's Jason Bourne meme, which is still extraordinary when we get that these days. So please do follow a comment below. I think we're going to get you another entry. I know there is a spy film that Spielberg has done that you have covered on your channel before.
Mhm.
And we'll get to that later this year. So this may be the last time we get you on. Hopefully, it'll be a lot, maybe a lot. Not to say it's more pleasant than always, but definitely better viewing. Viewing on the rewatch at home. And is there anybody else around? Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm just going to keep plugging it because I'm having so much fun with this series. Real deep dive into what it's like to be a broken, depressed Jedi Knight, Jedi Master. So part 5 spoiler discussion will be coming tomorrow by the time this video. 8 p.m. on the dot. We'll be live. We'll be going through everything as we always do. Theories. We don't even know how it's going to end. Is he going to? I'm not even going to say what he might meet because there might be people watching this that haven't seen episodes 1 to 4. So if you're a fan of Star Wars, if you're a fan of Kenobi, stick around for a few more weeks. It's been a lot of fun talking these, and it sort of sticks in nice with the Spielberg stuff because Spielberg and Star Wars go hand in hand with George Lucas. So yeah, um, that is going to do it for tonight's review. As I said, everybody at home, thank you so much for watching. Cam, for taking time out of your day to join me tonight. It's been a lot of fun talking, always a lot more entertaining, this discussion than the film. I'm going to be really honest to end it on a downer. So thank you for coming on, and everybody at home, we'll see you on the next one. Take care.